Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the president exerts executive power in unprecedented ways.
I'm not a dictator. I'm a man with great common sense, and I'm a smart person. And when I see what's happening to our cities, and then you send in troops, instead of being praised, they're saying you're trying to take over the republic.
From armed National Guard troops now walking the streets of D.C., with the president threatening to send in troops to other cities like Chicago and New York. To wind power company Ørsted, reeling from a last-minute order blocking a $4 billion project on the cusp of completion. The Trump White House now planning to halt another offshore wind farm. To the federal stake in Intl, with the chipmaker now warning the U.S. government's stake could, in fact, hurt global business. And now the president aiming his ire at South Korea on Truth Social before expressing optimism while sitting down with the country's new president in the Oval Office after the two nations struck a trade deal that capped tariffs on South Korea's exports to the U.S. at 15%. Plus, Elon Musk's new lawsuits against Apple and OpenAI seeing billions in damages after accusing both companies of hurting artificial intelligence competition. Also this evening, National Democrats convening to take stock and find a path forward in 2026 and beyond. We start today, though, at the White House. Thanks for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio as President Trump hosts his South Korean counterpart, President Myung. But just hours before the meeting, President Trump stoked tension by posting to social media, "What is going on in South Korea? Seems like a purge or revolution," he wrote. "Well, we can't have that and do business there." During the meeting, the South Korean leader launching a charm offensive, despite President Trump saying that he was reluctant to renegotiate any trade deal.
We have some additional trade because I hear they want to renegotiate the deal, but that's okay. I don't mind that. That doesn't mean they're going to get anything, but I don't mind.
Korea was able to attain economic growth and development through our ironclad alliance. And going forward, I hope to develop our alliance into a future-oriented alliance that encompasses areas not only limited to security, but also the economy and science and technology.
Joining us now with more, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with us live here in our Washington bureau. Wendy, we brought those remarks to our viewers and listeners live from the Oval Office. It was a little bit difficult to tell exactly what President Trump was getting at here on social media, referring to a purge or a revolution. I guess he was referring to what he referred to as raids in churches that went into military bases. This is a pretty outrageous allegation. Was it settled today?
I don't know if it was settled, but what we have determined that he was talking about, at least, was part of the investigation into Lee's predecessor, who, was impeached, and then there was over the martial law thing. There was a big mess there a few months ago in South Korea. And now there is an investigation into corruption by the former president and his family. And so the South Korean law enforcement did go into a unification church, which are, if you remember from the old days, we used to call them the Moonies when they lived here. Yeah. And they raided a unification church for evidence of, corruption involving the ex-president's wife. So that's what this was about. It was a few days ago. I don't know of any insurgencies into U.S. military bases. We haven't heard anything about that, as Trump suggested had happened. But this is part of the internal politics that are going on in South Korea. And so, I don't know if that's as much as I know about that.
It recalls a moment of Donald Trump playing videos for the president of South Africa and what some thought might have been an ambush today. But it was a pretty positive meeting. They seemed to get along. Translations worked all right. There were questions about a lot of things, but the president reached for Kim Jong-Un to talk about his great relationship with the North Koreans. Does that help us in Seoul?
No, it doesn't. It must have been very uncomfortable for President Lee, who you sort of saw sitting there very stiff with this smile sort of plastered on his face, waiting for the translations. And yes, and suggesting that there be a trilateral meeting with Kim Jong-un, and which a reporter brought up, but then Trump sort of embraced it. It was like, let's all get together. Let's all talk. Yeah. And President Xi, which would be extraordinary and highly unlikely that it would happen. But of course, then Lee left empty-handed. He tried to renegotiate the trade deal, and he ended up with no changes whatsoever. And so the trip is over now, and we'll see what happens next.
What there is exactly to show for it, I guess.
Right.
Wendy, thank you, as always. for the insights. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson joining us now for more on today's bilateral meeting here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, an expert in U.S. and China trade relations, as you well know if you're familiar with this program. Mary, it's great to have you back. Did today's session with the South Korean president bring us closer to or move us further away from a deal with China?
Well, I mean, one of the issues for South Korea and other Asian nations is how much they're going to remain integrated with China in terms of their exports to the United States. So there are very important issues that need to be discussed with the U.S. If the U.S. demands that so-called rules of origin are changed, limiting the amount of Chinese content in East Asian exports to the U.S., that will really have implications for their businesses. They may have to create supply chains exclusively for the United States. So there are serious issues. I'm afraid today's discussion really touched on things that even the president seemed to be admitting were misunderstandings or misinformation. So I don't think we moved the ball ahead at all today.
Well, I want to ask you as well about this investment in U.S. shipbuilding that we heard about from President Yi. Last week on Bloomberg, we talked about this, as a matter of fact, with Gene Soroka. But it's something that I asked Christopher Smart about today. He's with Arbroath and used to be an economic advisor to President Obama about the current trade deal here between the U.S. and South Korea and what it might mean for investment in our shipbuilding. Listen to what he said.
Korea has committed to invest, I think it's $350 billion in the U.S., including in shipbuilding. In return for that, they were able to match auto tariffs that the Japanese government was able to secure at 15%. So on paper, at least, it looks like a very good deal for Korea in the context of what other countries have been getting.
How does Beijing feel about Korea investing in U.S. shipbuilding, Mary?
Well, you know, I think just on the surface, there's nothing wrong with South Korea investing in U.S. shipbuilding. South Korea has an advantage in shipbuilding. They would be a welcomed investor in U.S. to increase U.S. shipbuilding. I think the Chinese understand that. What is looming in the background, though, are coming charges on Chinese ships that dock in the United States, particularly those that are owned by Chinese companies. So China has to see this as an offensive move, even though on its face, the simple foreign investment by South Korea and the United States is not really a threat to them.
Interesting. Well, there's a lot more that we can talk about here with regard to China, including a potential meeting. Mary, you heard me discussing this with Wendy, and the president was asked today about it. Setting up a meeting, a bilateral, trilateral, I guess, meeting, U.S., South Korea, China. Then he even suggested Kim Jong-Un from North Korea. Is this just happy talk in sort of an offhand remark in the Oval Office, or something that could actually happen?
Well, President Xi Jinping is not going to engage in any meeting, including bilaterally with President Trump, unless there's a deal that's already just waiting to be inked. It is completely unclear what we want from North Korea in the Trump administration, and if the North Koreans are anywhere close to being able to deliver on security guarantees or changes. They're very much involved deeply in the arms trade, and they're advancing in their technology. It's very hard to see what they think they could gain from some kind of moratorium or whatever it is the president believes that his special relationship with Kim Jong-Un could provide for the United States. So right now, I'd have to say it sounds like happy talk. There's not going to be any such meeting unless there's a lot of diplomatic groundwork that gets done and real outcomes that the Chinese could sign on to.
Yeah, well, President Trump is still threatening more tariffs on China. I believe a 200% tariff was the threat today, if no magnets. The latest strategy, I guess, of preempting whatever the next conversation is going to be with Beijing. But we're already seeing China pull back, and I'm sure that you've seen evidence of this as well. I mentioned Gene Soroka. He joined us last week on Bloomberg, runs the port of Los Angeles, and talked about the shift in cargo ships that he's seeing since President Trump's tariff policies took effect. Listen to how he put it.
What we have seen is cargo emanating from China really dropping. Back in 2018, it was 60% of our portfolio. Today, it's 45% and continuing to decline. An uptick from Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. Not so much from India. And with the 50% tariffs that were slapped on that country, I don't see much change there yet. But definitely a shift to Southeast Asia.
Are those numbers a motivating factor for President Xi, Mary? How low can those numbers get before China needs to worry?
Well, I love Gene. He's always so clear on what's happening at the Port of LA. And I think that's just reflective of what we have seen. And the shift away from dependence on the American market in China has been happening for a very long time. China got the message to diversify its trade, its import sources, its export destinations quite a while ago. The U.S. Hasn't been strategic about doing that, except in the case of China, where we raised tariffs early on in the first Trump administration. These kinds of threats are nothing new to President Xi Jinping. This is not going to move him. Yes, it is causing pain for particularly coastal provinces that are heavily dependent on export manufacturing. But this is not the future of China as Xi Jinping sees it. The Chinese have now, had a shot across the bow, a big one. We're going to withhold magnets if you continue to try to bully us. What they've gotten in response is more bullying. So they do have, tools that they can use to hurt the United States. And they're trying to get the U.S. to the bargaining table just as much as the U.S. is trying to get China. So this is a relationship that both sides need for now. But right today, we're not seeing any real change or breakthrough that will give us a hint as to where this is going to end up.
Yeah. So what happens first? The magnets start showing up, or we actually see a 200% tariff on China?
If we see a 200% tariff, we are definitely not going to see any magnets, and we're going to see more things disappear. There are many categories of exports where China is the dominant supplier. So they have more bullets, in a sense, to fire behind this one. I think that the negotiators, in particular Secretary Bessent and Trade Representative Greer, are doing all they can to make sure that they can get a negotiated settlement to the dispute that is to the liking of President Trump, and the Chinese side to the liking of President Xi Jinping. So whether they can make that progress in time to meet President Trump's, which seems to be an increasingly short fuse, we really don't know. That is a continuing source of great uncertainty, not only for the Port of LA, but for all businesses. But there's others out there, the 50% on Brazil, the increasing tensions that have been thrown at other countries like India. Those still remain out there, even as some uncertainty has dissipated now that we have deals with many of the advanced economies of the world, such as Japan, South Korea, et cetera. When the president holds a meeting like he did today, talking about new trade deals with South Korea, I think that makes companies worry even more about where's the best place to invest and source.
Well, it's always great to hear your insights, Mary. She's Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mary Lovely, we thank you. This morning on Bloomberg Surveillance, here on Bloomberg TV and radio, analysts discuss how markets are watching tariffs and inflation. Take a listen.
The rhetoric says that the 2% target's going to stick around, but let's be honest, they've missed it for 52 months. They're likely to miss it for another year, given what Powell said yesterday and the pressures coming from tariffs.
The inflation from tariffs has not yet happened, but it's on the way. When I look at the S&P 493, the market of everything else, there's a lot of businesses in tech hardware, consumer retail that have really yet started to see that pain.
We're about to see more tumult in the tariff space than we did in the first half of the year.
For a closer look at how Wall Street is watching this all unfold, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, I went away for a week. We're still having the same conversation when I come back.
Still having the same conversation, but I will tell you this, Joe. The market's attention has shifted just a bit. There was a lot of talk on Friday about the dovish comments from Jay Powell, the potential for rate cuts. But talking to people here today, right now, the big focus is on Nvidia. And there's been a big joke right now of what's more important to this market, what Jay Powell does next, what President Trump does next, or what Jensen Huang does next. And I think the answer you're going to find out is on Wednesday when Nvidia, the world's largest chip maker and the most valuable company, publicly traded company out there, does report earnings. We should point out this stock alone makes up 10% of the NASDAQ 100, 8% of the S&P 500. So as it goes, so too does the broader market. But there is a tariff tie-in, or at least a trade policy tie-in to all this, Joe. This is a company that prior to just a couple of years ago made the majority of its revenue from overseas, non-U.S. companies. But that revenue shift has shifted more to U.S.-based companies. Some of that is just primarily because of the AI trade and an AI trade that has been U.S. focused. But there's a big concern right now that this company is not able to sell into foreign markets, particularly China, at the same rate that it would have, primarily because of some of the policies coming out of the White House. And when we get those earnings report, Joe, after the bell on Wednesday, the big question is going to be how much revenue it made, how much earnings that it made, but more importantly, what Jensen Huang has to say about the company's ability to re-enter and expand into the Chinese market.
And with 8% of the S&P 500, it seems like everybody's going to feel it for better or worse. Romaine, thank you, as always. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick in New York. We'll have a lot to talk about on Wednesday. Coming up, how the markets are responding to President Trump's economic agenda beyond what we just heard. We'll dive into it with Nancy Tengler of Laffer Tengler Investments up ahead. But first, the president has amplified his criticism of blue cities like Chicago, renewing threats to send in the National Guard beyond D.C. and L.A. We'll discuss that with Democratic Congresswoman Robin Kelly of Illinois. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Chicago, Illinois is a disaster. I have property there. It's a disaster what's going on in Chicago. And you get Pritzker, he's violating our rights. I made the statement that next should be Chicago because, as you all know, Chicago is a killing field right now. And they don't acknowledge it.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thank you for joining us. President Trump from this morning in the Oval Office there, reiterating his criticism of Chicago, floating the idea that it may well be the next city where he plans to deploy National Guard troops. Joining us now on Balance of Power with her reaction to all of this, President Trump's latest comments, Democratic Congresswoman Robin Kelly of Illinois, whose district includes part of the south side of Chicago. Congresswoman, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. You heard the president. Today's not the first time, and the Washington Post reported over the weekend that, in fact, Chicago would be next, with National Guard troops deployed on the streets of your city. The White House even kicked out a fact sheet today refuting the narrative of lower crime rates in your city, talking more about anecdotal evidence, the way people feel. Give us your take on what's happening on the street there. Does Chicago need the National Guard to keep streets safe?
Chicago does not need the National Guard. Chicago could use gun violence intervention funding that he's seen fit to claw back from agencies that were promised funding. And he was so worried about crime, he wouldn't have shut down the Office of Gun Violence Prevention on day 1 or 2 of his presidency. The stats are the stats. Crime has gone down. No one has said there's no more crime, but Chicago is working on it, and they've been working on it. And we're seeing the proof of them working on it. Crime has gone down. It's not eliminated, but it's gone down.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly the case according to Chicago's own crime tracker. I'm looking at it right now. It's got crime down in all categories from this time last year. Do you believe, though, that's a total representation of what's happening in Chicago?
I do. I mean, I don't think the mayor or anybody else, the police superintendent, is trying to say, there's not more work to do. There is more work to do. Any crime is too much crime, but he's pointing to all Democratic cities, and I would say all Democratic cities that have black mayors on top of it is just part of his, scheme of fear, racism, and division.
Well, you know what a lot of Republicans are saying right now, and I've been hearing this since before Chicago was part of the conversation, is that this is a win politically for Republicans, that the whole point of this is for Donald Trump to get Democrats like you to push back on this idea, to reinforce the idea that Democrats are soft on crime. Congresswoman, how would you react to that?
Well, we're not soft on crime. We just have other ways to deal with it. Again, crime has gone down.
Do you think that's what's actually happening, though? Is this an effort to try to make you look soft on crime?
I'm sure they're going to try everything they can do because they know they're on their way to losing in November 2026, and he doesn't want to give up his kingdom. So that's what this is all about. And we just have to keep speaking the truth and also do everything we can do to decrease crime in all of our cities. But there's a lot of proof that red states have crime too, a lot of crime.
He was actually asked today if he would send National Guard troops into cities in red states, suggesting he said that there aren't many of them, but that he would, in fact. You started talking about the funding that you need, though, to pursue crime programs in Chicago. What are the proven methods that you're referring to?
Well, you can look at, people talk about CRED. I can name a lot of organizations people, have not heard of. Good Kids Mad City, Polished Pebbles. There's a lot of different there's a lot of different programs that work to kids off the block, to keep kids off the street, to give kids hope, to give kids positive things, to do proven methods of gun violence prevention. It doesn't stop everything, it doesn't stop every murder, every, homicide, or, programs to stop suicide. But there's definitely improvements, and those are improvements all around the United States, not just in Chicago.
Where are the guns coming from, Congresswoman? Illinois, of course, has very strict gun laws, so they're coming from out of state. Can they be stopped at the border? How do you address that?
Well, when we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, my part of it was the trafficking and straw purchasing, because every time I went to D.C., people would say that Chicago has the toughest gun laws, but if no one else around us has tough gun laws, that makes it very hard. And if you take the resources away from alcohol, tobacco, and firearm, who, go to the gun stores, whose job it is to track guns, it's difficult to do that. I believe since I've been in Congress the last 12 years, Indiana has made it even easier to buy a gun, as other places have around the United States. So, our guns come from Indiana. I would venture to say they're coming from, some of the southern states. And I know in New York, they talk about, their guns coming up from the southern states also. But we're kind of like an oasis. At least, New York has New Jersey and Connecticut, but we're an oasis in many, many ways.
I want to ask you, we only have a minute left, Congresswoman, about no cash bail, because the president signed an EO today ending that practice, aimed to at least. Your state of Illinois was the first in the nation to pass a cashless bail law. What does Donald Trump not understand?
He doesn't understand that this gives judges the discretion, more discretion to make that decision. They can say no if they think it's someone that will, go out and be violent. They're too risky. But if, they have nothing in their past, or the judge feels that, they'll be safe and it's okay to, let them out, they have that discretion. So, but Donald Trump doesn't care. Again, this is part of his fear. This is part of his distraction from other things going on in the world, or other things going on in the United States. Like he said, he would lower prices. That hasn't happened. So these are all distractions.
Well, let's keep talking about this if the Guard, in fact, does show up in Chicago. Congresswoman Robin Kelly of Illinois, we thank you, as always. Coming up, Democrats from around the country gathering in Minneapolis for the DNC's summer meeting. We'll bring you those details coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I just made $10 billion or $11 billion for the United States of America. And yeah, there will be other cases. If I have that opportunity again, I would do that. And then, you do have stupid people say, oh, that's a shame. It's not a shame. It's called business.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Having heard from President Trump there earlier today, touting the government's 10% stake in Intl. saying he would, quote, want to see many more cases like it, unquote. Though that runs counter to the view of some in his own party. Kevin O'Leary, a supporter, of course, of Shark Tank fame, chairman of O'Leary Ventures, saying today, quote, I abhor this idea. We let dead old companies die in our version of capital markets. Intel should have been sold for car parts 3 years ago, unquote. Intel is just one of several companies upon which the president has had a direct impact. Among them, Tesla, Nvidia, and now as well Denmark's Ørsted, which today fell to a record low after the Trump administration blocked construction of an almost finished offshore wind farm that it's building in Rhode Island. Joining us now in our Washington bureau with more on all of this is Bloomberg's Enda Curran. Enda, there are questions about whether this is in fact capitalist, never mind conservative.
Well, it's certainly a more interventionist administration, Joe. No doubt about it. We've had a string of examples now. Remember, of course, Nippon Steel's takeover of US Steel with the golden share there. You have the deal with the chip companies to take some of their revenue from some of their chip sales into China. And then, of course, examples like Intel that you're mentioning as well. Critics would say this poses sovereign risk. It poses potential loss of taxpayer money. And of course, you know, ideologically, the government should not be intervening in these free markets. Now, the White House is adamant that A, they're talking about areas of national security, for example, or B, in the case of Intel, they remind voters that Intel was already receiving US government support anyway from the CHIPS Act. They're merely putting some conditions around that, which is getting a piece of the company in return. So very split views on this, but no doubt about it, it is an interventionist approach and it is catching investors off guard.
The president today on Truth Social writes, I paid zero for Intel. It is worth approximately $11 billion. All goes to the USA. Why are stupid people unhappy with that? Is it true we paid zero for Intel? Wasn't this CHIPS Act money that was being invested?
Yeah, so they actually are. They will obviously be getting real money, and that's, I think, the point that the president is making is this: will it come out of the CHIPS Act? And they've just put these conditions around it. But there's no doubt there's taxpayer money on the table here, whether it goes in the form of grants or an equity stake. The question is, will the government get that return on the investment? Will they get their money back or will they lose it? And of course, as the industry experts would say, there's a lot of scrutiny on Intel and its performance and whether or not it can turn around as well. So it's the Intel story, I think, has a bit to go yet.
Fascinating. Enda, thank you. Bloomberg's Enda Curran with us live in Washington. Here's President Trump Friday from the Oval Office on the impact his tariff policy is having on the stock market.
The stock market's up almost 1,000 points. And it's basically on the news that the release that just came out from government that the tariffs that everybody was talking about, that the whole world respects us for because of what we did. It's had a huge impact, and the stock market is way up.
Wearing the cap, Trump was right about everything. Joining us now on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, more insights into the market's reaction to President Trump's policies, whether they include taking a stake in Intel or adding new tariffs to the picture. Nancy Tengler, CEO, CIO of Laffer Tengler Investments. It's great to have you back here, Nancy. Broadly speaking, it is hard to argue with what the president is saying here. The S&P 500 is hanging just below an all-time high. We're just above 6,400 right now. This doesn't look like a market that's too worried about the risks of tariffs taking effect, does it?
No, actually, I'm still laughing about you. The president was right about everything comment. The market is pretty sanguine. That so far during earnings season, we did not see any major impact from tariffs. Margins remained near historic highs. Companies were beating not just 83% on the top line, 83% on the bottom line, 80% on the top line, which is the real noteworthy number. I don't remember ever seeing that many companies beat on that. All of that said, we have not yet seen the full effects of tariffs, but I am one of those who are somewhat sanguine because I think the corporate tax incentives in the we call it the Obama bill at Laffer Tengler are pretty robust and will bring about $150 billion in cash to corporate balance sheets. And so I think that is a good enough offset for me to remain bullish. But I'm not bullish because tariffs haven't caused a problem. I'm bullish because we really are in the fourth industrial revolution, and the technology, the CapEx spend is going to continue for some time, and that will drive the economy as well as earnings growth.
Well, and boy, that's going to be in a very clear focus on Wednesday when Nvidia reports. But it's the chip maker Intl that we were just talking about here, Nancy. That stock was actually lower today. And I know the stake was in the news last week, but having a barrage of commentary from administration officials doing Sunday morning television, the president back out there today, doesn't seem to be drawing a massive amount of retailer or institutional investment into Intl. Will that change?
Oh, I don't think so, Joe. I think this is one of the worst ideas I've heard in my 40 years of being in this business.
Wow.
I mean, first of all, the government is going to dilute existing shareholders. They have warrants. If they exercise those warrants, that will dilute existing shareholders further. They're not necessarily bringing customers, or at least they are saying that they're not. And what we do know is that Intl is so far behind, it's likely they will never catch up. You know, the pitch that Bhutan made to the president was we're the last or one of the only homegrown chip manufacturers, but the plant in Arizona and just in general is now delayed until 2031. So this all sounds great, and the president can say that he made $10 billion for the American people. But I remember Chrysler, and the first bailout was Jimmy Carter in 1979. And then, you know, Lee Iacocca kind of turned things around, but not really. And then the second bailout was in 2009. And I don't see a lot of Chrysler.
Yes, that's right.
On the road. So this doesn't work. The government is not good at this. They should focus on governing and national defense and leave business to business people. And I get it, the president's a business person, but that's not his role currently. And this company should, I agree with Kevin O'Leary, maybe for the first time in my career.
Wow. Take it out behind the barn and shoot it, I think is what he said, Nancy. And it sounds like we're going to lose a lot of money if you don't think Intl is ever going to catch up. That's a pretty remarkable statement. I want to ask you about the Federal Reserve while you're with us, because we had a BAFO rally on Friday, and there are a lot of questions about whether it was in fact justified following the comments from Jay Powell at Jackson Hole. Bloomberg Economics weighed in on this, disagreeing with the market's reaction, suggesting that there were hawkish undertones not reflected in the reaction on Wall Street. And I spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power today with Christopher Smart. He's with our Growth Group, former economic advisor in the Obama administration. Here's what he had to say about the reaction to Powell at Jackson Hole. Let's listen.
Markets, of course, always tend to overreact to Jackson Hole because it follows, I think, what I've called in the past the Jackson Hole news hole. There's been very little guidance from the Fed leading up to those meetings. And so the chairman's speech becomes all that much more important and that much more carefully dissected, particularly in this moment with not just very important economic cross currents, but obviously the pressure from the White House on Jay Powell himself, on some of his Fed colleagues. There's just a lot of noise in the background.
Nancy, is the market going to find itself over its skis in September?
Potentially, Joe. I think you saw a little bit of a pullback today as I think investors digested what he did really say and what he didn't really say. But I've been very critical of this Fed chairman because he has pivoted at, he's been behind at every turning point, and he's made a lot of statements and then pivoted in the opposite direction at the next meeting. So I'm always surprised that the market puts this much credence into this particular Fed. I long and fervently hope for the days of Alan Greenspan, where we heard nary a word from the Fed chairman, and that left investors to actually have to think and dissect the data.
So there's too much Fed speak is what it comes down to, Nancy.
There is. And I think, unfortunately, this Fed chairman has been wrong an awful lot. So let's keep our fingers crossed that we get some sort of movement away from data dependence, because we know the numbers have been fraught, and that we get a new Fed chairman that's going to focus on maybe narrowing the mission creep that we've seen from the Fed.
Well, I can only assume that some of the pressure from President Trump will get people adjusting expectations as we make our way toward that September meeting. Is that the only cut we're going to get then for the rest of the year?
It may be, Joe. I mean, I think the Fed was remiss in cutting 50 basis points last fall, and that market backed that up with 100% basis point move up in the yield of the 10-year. So I think if we get a cut, Here's what I'll say about it. In the 1990s, we had 3% inflation and a 5% Fed funds rate. The 10-year was between 7 and 8%, and we had robust stock returns. So if productivity drives this economy and the markets, we will be okay with just a 25 basis point cut.
All right, Nancy, it's great to see you. Nancy Tengler, CEO, CIO, Laffer Tengler Investments. Great to have you back on Bloomberg. Coming up, Democrats gathering in Minneapolis for the big summer meeting of the DNC. We'll discuss what is on their agenda. Plus, President Trump is reiterating his criticism of the city of Chicago. We'll talk about the implications of him possibly sending troops to Chicago when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Here are some of the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Salvadoran immigrant Kilmar Abrego Garcia has been taken into custody again after he was arrested this morning in Baltimore by U.S. ICE agents. Happened during a mandatory check-in appointment. It happened less than 72 hours after the judge overseeing his criminal case in Tennessee released Abrego Garcia so he could return to Maryland to await trial. The Trump administration has threatened to deport Abrego Garcia to Uganda, a country where he has no ties, unless he pleads guilty to human smuggling charges. Abrego Garcia, a Maryland resident who is married to a U.S. citizen, has filed a challenge to the new arrest, and a Maryland judge has already temporarily blocked his deportation to Uganda. Elon Musk is accusing Apple and OpenAI of unfairly favoring the AI app across iPhones while harming competition and depriving consumers of choice. Musk filed the federal lawsuit today in Fort Worth, Texas, on behalf of his companies X and XAI. Last year, Apple announced it would partner with OpenAI to integrate ChatGPT into its products. The Musk lawsuit claims the exclusive arrangement, as it calls it, allows the companies to maintain their monopolies and prevent innovators from competing. Apple and OpenAI did not immediately respond to a request for comment. And starting today, Democrats from across the country gathering in Minneapolis for the DNC's summer meeting, the first under new chair Ken Martin.
We cannot be the only party that plays by the rules anymore. We've got to stand up and fight. We're not going to have a hand tied behind our back anymore. Let's grow a damn spine and get in this fight, Democrats.
In addition to developing strategy to turn around widespread party pessimism and plot efforts to retake the House next fall, they will also be unofficially looking toward 2028 and the election calendar. Politico now reporting representatives from New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, and Iowa are all making their case to lead the party's primary contests. Iowa and New Hampshire, of course, had opened the competitions for decades. But in 2022, then President Joe Biden changed the calendar, moving South Carolina to first place, bumping up Michigan and eliminating Iowa after it faced major issues with the 2020 caucuses. Joining us now with their reaction to this story and a lot more, this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Democratic strategist Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden. It's great to have you both with us. I've got to start on this primary schedule just because you're here, Rick Davis. New Hampshire, closely associated with Rick Davis and John McCain, of course. Will it be back up front for both parties this year?
Yeah, I got to believe that the Democratic Party would not make the mistake of bypassing New Hampshire and going straight to South Carolina. Frankly, we were all there in Iowa, the debacle in 2016, and honestly, I'd try to even resurrect that if I were the Democrats, just to prove they can put on a caucus. But the end of the day is these caucuses, these primaries ought to mirror one another. The Republicans and the Democrats should be in the states at the same time, talking to the same voters to give them a comparison, right? The last thing you ever want to do is cede turf to your opponent without you being there to make the counter argument.
I think Joe Biden learned that this year with the write-in campaign, strangely, was underway in New Hampshire. The argument, of course, from a lot of progressives, Megan, is that Iowa and New Hampshire don't look like the rest of the country, that they don't represent the electorate. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And we learned that in 2020. I learned that firsthand being on Joe Biden's campaign. I think we got 4th or 5th, depending on how the results were. Then we went to New Hampshire and got 4th or 5th. I can't remember how it all played out, but then we went to, we ended up winning, and he ended up winning and being president of the United States. So, when you let other people vote, it's amazing what happens. happens. I think the caucuses draw such a little representation of even that state. So few people turn out to caucus. It's kind of unbelievable. And then they really decide the narrative and the momentum moving forward. And I think that the thought process here is that more people in more states that really matter and that look like the United States should be the ones making these decisions.
Well, it sounds like we might all be meeting for the first in the nation primary in Manchester once again here. We were talking about, gosh, it was a year ago last week we were in Chicago for the DNC, for the convention that nominated Kamala Harris. And earlier this hour, we spoke with Democratic Congresswoman Robin Kelly of Illinois. Her district includes part of the city, part of the south side of Chicago, about President Trump's latest criticism of the city. I specifically asked her about the president's threat to send in the National Guard. Here's what her reaction included.
Chicago does not need the National Guard. Chicago could use gun violence intervention funding that he's seen fit to claw back from agencies that were promised funding. And he was so worried about crime, he wouldn't have shut down the Office of Gun Violence Prevention on day 1 or 2 of his presidency. The stats are the stats. Crime has gone down. No one has said there's no more crime, but Chicago was working on it, and they've been working on it. And we're seeing the proof of them working on it. Crime has gone down.
Rick, you've made the point that is the exact response that Donald Trump is trying to evoke, and that is a political win for Republicans.
Yeah, he could have written her talking points today. Look, Democrats have to get used to something that's very fundamental. They are the party of urban America. Multicultural, higher income, higher education, cities. And they have to prove that they can manage cities. Nobody in the world thinks cities in America are safer than they used to be. And so get right on this issue. Don't let Donald Trump get to the right of you on, crime in cities. Take it on. It should be the #1 issue, especially now that immigration has fallen down to, later.
The big story in Washington today is the fact that some National Guard troops are carrying weapons. They are now armed as they stand in front of Union Station and other locations throughout the city, some of which we're showing here on Bloomberg TV. Does Rick have a point? Should Democrats embrace some of this idea?
Well, I don't think Democrats should take the bait. So I do agree that Democrats taking the bait, and they are falling into the don't believe your lying eyes theory. And that does not work for Democrats. We've seen that play out time and time again. Democrats should be focusing this conversation right back to the economy and lowering costs. That is what people actually care about. There are so few people who live in D.C. or live in these major cities. They don't understand the dynamics. They don't understand the specifics. But Donald Trump is getting out there saying, this is what I'm doing. And it's just like with immigration. And Democrats are letting him win on the issue. And instead, they need to own back the messaging, turn it back to the economy, and push Donald Trump on why he is not lowering costs.
If troops start rolling into Chicago, then what should be J.B. Pritzker's approach? Welcome?
Look, my own view is I think J.B. Pritzker ought to bring in the National Guard himself and say, these are my guys, they're my state.
Okay.
I'm going to put them in Chicago, and I'm not going to listen to what's going on in Washington, D.C., because that's noise in the system. I agree that we need to do more on crime, and I'm going to do it myself.
That'd be a pretty interesting move to try to call the president on his bluff there.
I mean, I don't know what the legalities are here of that.
He's the governor. He can do what he wants.
I just think that we just cannot fall into the trap. We need to continue to push on the economy, continue to have solutions for lowering costs, and let the American people see what Democrats really stand for. But trying to be the party that does not want to fight crime or fight immigration is not a winning strategy for the midterms nor for the 2028 election.
Well, this loomed large in the conversations the president had today in the Oval Office. I don't know what, by the way, 4 or 5 hours combined. He was wound up today. Talked a lot about crime. He also talked about geopolitics. He had the president of South Korea with him while speaking alongside the president of South Korea. The president touted his relationship with, of all people, Kim Jong-Un of North Korea. Take a listen.
Kim Jong-Un and I had a very good relationship, as you remember, and still do. And when I came in, I didn't know him. We had 2 summits, but we became very friendly. Respect. It was great respect. We think we can do something in that regard with respect to North and South, and I think you are much more prone to doing that than other leaders that I've been working with. I look forward to meeting with Kim Jong-Un in the appropriate future.
These were unsolicited remarks, Rick, and it's basically the way he opened the meeting with the president of South Korea. He later referred to the the incredible experience he had visiting the DMV and suggested he might do it again. Is this a strategy of some sort?
Well, it's a good strategy to make your guest very uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I mean, he does know that nuclear weapons are pointed at South Korea from North Korea. They want to annihilate that entire community. I mean, I just thought the President, Lee, did a great job of being stoic, not showing emotion, not arguing with the President.
Right.
We've seen how that goes. And yet, at the same time, I mean, it's this sort of card that Donald Trump loves to play. I'm going to get that Nobel Prize no matter what, and I'm going to do it with North Korea and South Korea today.
So is Donald Trump the one to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula?
No, this is just despicable. He's just throwing democracy in the face of all of our allies. He did the same thing to Zelensky in the Oval Office. He's doing the same thing to South Korea. The United States should not be on the side of dictators. This is reprehensible that this is now our foreign policy. Let's meet with dictators over the people who have democracies and that we are allies with.
Yeah, you wonder what people think in the region as they entertain the idea of a four-way meeting between Presidents Xi, Lee, Kim Jong-Un, and Trump. I'm guessing that's not going to happen, Rick.
Yeah, that's going to be a complicated one to put together. And I don't really quite understand it because the last time Donald Trump met with the great leader of North Korea, it turned out to be a real bummer. He walked away from the meeting with nothing. And so why trust a guy who's left you wanting?
He talked about renaming the Department of Defense the Department of War, along with many other topics in the Oval Office. He had Pete Hegseth next to him as a result. I know a lot of this stuff is just spitballing, but at what point do you take that type of rhetoric seriously?
I think these are just more things that he wants to throw out there and get everyone all worked up about, get more Democrats to comment on how outrageous it is. It is outrageous. But again, Democrats need to focus on what is important, and that is the economy. Do not get wrapped up around this. They can't change the name without Congress. Do not get yourselves worked up and start going out there fighting this. It's just one more thing he wants to messy the noise with and continue to just drive a wedge between everyone.
Yeah, that brings back some memories. 2019 on Bloomberg TV of President Trump and Kim Jong-Un. Will the nature of their relationship play into whatever happens with China, or is this just the president having fun on the Oval on a Monday in August?
I think there's a little bit of sort of the president having fun in the Oval in an August day, but at the end of the day, he's not without his resources to create change, right? We've already seen it. Anybody who doubts his ability to change the world order as it exists today hasn't been paying attention to the last year. And so I don't think you want to assume anything. I mean, the fact is we went in today not thinking that the president was going to attend the APEC conference and potentially have a meeting with, President Xi of China. And now it looks like that may be a summit in the waiting. Wow. And then what else is going to happen? Normally, the North Korean premier is not invited to the APEC summit. So somebody's got to say yes to that. My guess is nobody's going to get consensus on that one.
I take your word on that. And in just our remaining moment here, Megan, a Trump-Xi summit will be more productive than the last?
I don't know. If he continues to act like he is currently, I don't think we're going to have a lot of productive foreign policy in the entire
China would also have to follow through what it agrees on.
Well, correct. But I don't think that Trump is anywhere being serious about having these meetings that actually are going to have any diplomatic rewards for the United States.
So it's a get-together, a feel-me-out like we saw with Vladimir Putin, or it doesn't happen at all?
I don't think it probably happens at all. And if it does, it probably is going to be like the Vladimir Putin meeting where we just have a lot of hoopla around it. Nothing happens. And the United States, again, looks like fools on the world stage.
As always, we're going to find out together with the help of Rick Davis and Megan Hayes. Great conversation. Thank you both for the great panel. And tonight, just 90 minutes. You're going to want to stay right here on Bloomberg. SpaceX is set to launch Starship Flight 10 from southern Texas after plans were scrapped yesterday to, quote, troubleshoot an issue with ground systems, unquote. If it launches, you'll hear it and see it here on Bloomberg. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. Find it on the terminal and online. And we'll meet you back here tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.